Okay. All right. So today we're here to talk about Polish pauper labor bureaus and contract labor. um, this is kind of a conflicted message because it is a complicated era in history that covers from about 1848 to about 1890. And so it's not necessarily always talked about like this, but we're just going to dig a little deeper so that we can have a fuller and better understanding of what's actually going on during this period of immigration and labor practices in the United States. It is a bit of a heavy uh, topic, so there's lots to cover. So I hope I don't go too fast. For those that are viewing this online, you can stop and pause and go through and read some of the things that I don't fully cover. But I do provide all of the information and all of the evidence necessary so that you can go back through and use this for genealogy purposes or future studies. For those of you that are interested in writing about this, I know a lot of you have contacted me to be able to update your own histories at your museums and different things like that. So we'll go ahead and just get started and dig right in. So some recommended readings just to get you on the same page as me. What we're talking about is a contract system that's being developed in the United States. And it doesn't seem like a nefarious or a coercive practice, but we have to understand the time. And so, for an example, I'm on contract here at the museum, but that doesn't mean that I'm under contract labor. And so these terms that are being used have a deeper meaning that you have to kind of really dig into. And so Amy Drew Stanley out of Chicago has a book From Bondage to Contract, and she covers wage labor and also marriage contracts and how these contracts that are given out during the 1850s aren't necessarily giving rights and freedoms for anybody. Because when you specifically marriage contracts, when you sign that contract, you are giving away your personal rights to actually own property at that time. And so while it's seen as you are actively signing the contract, so you have the freedom to do so or not to do so. Once you do, you then are in that contract system, give away your ability to own land, your ability to kind of have your own individual freedom. And so that's what an actual contract is. Other books like Gunther Peck's Reinventing Free Labor. Free labor is not uh, the term free is kind of confusing as well because it's not free labor as far as like freedom labor, but getting work for free for the employer. So he covers padrones and immigrant workers, but he usually only covers the North American West. So past the Midwest, not necessarily talking about Minnesota, Michigan, or Illinois or any of these upper Midwest states, but talks about the California, New Mexico, Arizona, and those areas that are also affected. Another good book is Stamped from the Beginning. Ibram Kendi does an excellent job, not only including African American history, but also including Polish history, because chattel slavery in the United States is not the only form of slavery that's out there. There's also lots of stuff going on in Poland, and I think he does an excellent job in including the entire story so that we have a better understanding of what's going on and how we're all interconnected in these global histories. So not just focusing on American history, but on history as it affects and ripples out to the other countries. It's also important not to compare tragedies at this time. Um, you know, uh, each individual tragedy or each individual event is unique. There is a common theme of commodity-based labor that we'll talk about, but each individual's experiences do differ. So the first thing I want to discuss for the Polish historians is that Zahablem is or forebred era of immigration. It is a myth, and so it actually comes from a quote from a Górale or a Highlander in the lower Zakopane areas of Poland, who basically was asked why he came to this country. He mentions that he's here for bread, and so this becomes the standard that all Polish populations in the entire country are coming over for bread. So it's not, it's important to distinguish that the Gorales here are different than the rest of the cultures of Poland, including the Kashubians, and each one has their own individual story because they belong or are occupied by different countries. And so the Gorales are occupied by Austria. The people in Białystok or the eastern parts of Poland are occupied by Russia, and then the western parts are occupied, and northern parts are occupied by Prussia. So each individual country has to require its own studies to be able to go in and exactly tell what kind of revolutions are going on, whether they're refugees or escaping, whatever situation. And so today I just want to note that we are focusing on Prussian occupied Poland, so the northern and western parts of the country, not necessarily those other parts, though it does kind of combine together once they enter the United States. But it's a good quote that I found from an anonymous Polish immigrant was that I came to New York because I heard the streets were paved with gold, but when I got here, I learned three things. The streets are not paved with gold. They are not paved at all. And in fact, I am expected to pave them. And so we'll just dig right into the evidence. This is pretty heavy, but I mostly want to talk about this idea of free passage. This is a article by Jan Prokalski. He's a professor at the University in Virginia. Not necessarily the end-all be-all professional when it comes to immigration. He's in fact a linguist that studied the Kashubian language in the 70s. But he does have this information available and it's out there. And so he states that the immigrants came from a poor farming areas, which I contest as well, but from the Kashubian regions in southern West Prussia and Pomerania. Mostly the Kashirski, the Hojniki, the Shavovsky and Bitovsky districts, which are where the Kashubian immigrants from Bitov are actually coming from. And he states that there's an era of immigration from 1848 to 1860 in which representatives of the Maritime Navigation Company of Hamburg lured thousands of these southern Kashubs to America every year by offering free ocean passage. Well, nothing in this world is free and never been and probably never will be. So what does that actually mean, that free passage? And so he talks about these eras of Kashubian immigration. He basically states that most of the immigrants that were Kashubian are from the southern district of modern-day Kashubia, so from Bitov down to Hojnica, not necessarily up in the Putsk or the Hel Peninsula, but these southern parts that are being trafficked out of the area. Or given free passage, as he states. But he does give us some information and some studies that have been done, about 50 by 1860 through 1890, which is the main era that we're going to talk about today. 55% of the population of Bitau had left for America. They're in this system where the Prussian government is creating the Prussian Settlement Commission to take over Polish lands and create a workforce of these Kashubians to engage in the industrialized German system. So Prussia is an industrial company. They are industrializing using factories and those types of industries rather than agricultural. Austria is focused on agricultural work. So you can see just within the imperial lines today how Prussia has more railroads, more infrastructure, and more industrialism than the lower parts of Poland that belong to Austria. And again, Russia is different as well. But in doing so, they made it illegal for you to own land. You could not homestead these 30-acre plots that they had available. So they would purchase that land and kick you off of it and send you into usually Poznan or another industrial city to work for the German industrialism. However, when you got there, if you could not find a job because all of the people are competing for these German jobs, it is stated by Dr. Max Weber and Karl Marx that these individuals are unwanted and there's too many of them. There's also a big population explosion in the area because there's no longer a German Junker in charge of telling you how many children you can have. So you go from about 2 to 3 children per lifetime to upwards of 14 to 17 kids. And again, a massive Polish population explosion, and these Germans just don't know what to do with the laborers. So In turn, they kick them out of the country. It is a deportation process systematically to rid this area of Polish people. This is what is called the Polish question. Now you can do deeper studies into Napoleon and how Napoleon gets involved in, in those early ages, all the way up until 1863, where he is really bad mouthing the originally the King of Prussia, and then later on the Prime Minister. But he's bad mouthing them because of this system. You're systematically oppressing a population, going backwards basically into the Padron system, which is an archaic system that was well before the serfdom, and well before those, and was considered a terrible system, hundreds of years ago. And now all of a sudden we're trying to reestablish that same labor practice, and so he that's why he ends up in the Prussian area, seizing Gdansk and trying to take over, to reestablish some better policies. However, it doesn't necessarily work. He goes in, they change temporarily, and they go right back to the same system all the way really until World War One, which can be seen with lots of different evidences. However, those books don't mention Kashubians specifically. They'll often call them ethnic Poles. And so we have to read between the lines when it comes to these documents and pull out, okay, well, what area are they talking about? Who are they talking about? And they'll often state that they're either Germans or Poles, but they're actually these Kashubian people that live in the northern parts of Poland. And so the Hamburg American line, or the Hamburg is specifically designed to take these individuals from Kashubia and bring them into the United States. They have a deal with American companies to be able to do this. And so the two countries are working together. In fact, we see lots of evidence of the populations of Prussia and the United States working together, trading policies. There's railroad companies that exist in Prussia that are American. There are Prussian-owned railroad companies that exist in the United States as well. And so all the way down to our prison systems, we share ideas. And so our prison system in the northern parts of America are utilized in Prussia as well. So the idea of putting up the walls and keeping the population inside, only allowing a window above them so that they have to have that connection with God, and that is the only outside connection that they have to the world. And so that was established in Prussia during this time as well. And so we even have Dr. Max Weber's father, who is a Prussian railroad tycoon, coming into the United States and drives the Golden Stake in the Transcontinental Railroad. He is there with Ulysses S. Grant to drive that Golden Stake. And so there's relationships that happen. Not to mention the Bancroft treaties, in which George Bancroft, an American historian, and Otto von Bismarck, who is in charge of the culture comp, was working together to create the first immigration policies ever experienced in the entire world. Prior to this form of immigration, there was no such thing as immigration policies. And we still use those immigration policies today. So it's a very important immigration studies for those of out there that teach, to talk about this era specifically, because that is where we get our original immigration policies from, and why maybe they're so messed up in the first place. But just for some context, I wanted to say that labor trafficking often puts images in our head of people being thrown in vans and taken against their will. That's not necessarily what I'm talking about. What I'm saying is that it's a system of bondage labor in which you mortgage your future labor to a company or to an individual in return for some sort of service. And then after that, they use things like fraud, force, or coercion to be able to get you to complete that contract and pay them back. And so it's a form of debt bondage is really what it is. Oops. So the first piece of hard evidence that I will talk about is the 38th Congress, U.S. Statutes at Large, Volume 13. It was signed in July 4th, Independence Day in 1864. And what this originally does is set up an immigration process. And so this is appointing a commissioner of immigration, the salary that he receives, and the fact that he can use 25,000 American dollars, so tax money, to create a system of immigration in the United States that is designed to specifically go after previously disenfranchised populations, like Poland, who in the Warsaw Treaty of 1773 made everybody a serf. You could no longer be a nobleman. You could no longer own land. You could no longer do these things unless you're in the Russian part of Poland. And so that creates a disenfranchised population, somebody that doesn't have the same rights and privileges as everyone else. And so that's who they're attacking. So this is not just Prussia, but they're also attacking or taking people from Norway and Sweden. The Sami population actually ends up in Alaska, teaching the indigenous people up there in Alaska how to herd caribou. To make them reindeer. So you put a rein on a caribou to be able to take them around, and then that caribou then becomes a reindeer used for food, because our industrialism was taking over the crab industry and the fishing out of the ports, deteriorating the ability to make and create food for themselves. And so we're using that population as well. You'll also find in genealogy records that most Norwegian people, when they come here, or Swedish or Prussian, end up as domestic servants of some sort or another. And so it's a shared history of the Baltic region in which they're using these populations that are not allowed to homestead anymore. They made those 30-acre plots illegal, and they create what is called pauper labor to bring to the United States and to trade amongst each other. You'll find lots of documents where Germans are doing this with Russia as well, taking these populations, these pauper populations, and selling them into Russia, Siberia, and the like. And that actually lasts much longer. Up until 1939, they are still doing this to the Polish people. And so it's an era of Polish slavery that isn't talked about. It's well known in Poland that this happens. They talk about it all the time, but it just hasn't made it into the American culture or American academics to really discuss that this is a population that is seen strictly as a supplemental labor for the industrial imperial countries that surround it. The second part, and this is just down the page, this is establishing the systems and processes, and I'll just read a little bit of it. You can pause it here and read the rest of it if you want to. But immigrants shall pledge the wages of their labor for a term not exceeding 12 months to repay the expenses of their immigration. This is the initial act. Now, later on, we'll talk about how they changed this to make it last more than a year. But this is a congressional act. This is signed by Abraham Lincoln. This is developed by William H. Seward, and all of the individuals at Congress get around and they are discussing how to create immigration in a post-slavery society. And the Germans and the English are said in other newspaper articles and documents that they throw down their shovels and they say, well, I'm not doing this work. I'm not going to do it. So who are you going to bring into the United States to feed industrialism as we are expanding westward? And this is what the solution entails. And again, you can read the rest of that if you'd like. It also states that no immigrant in the United States who shall arrive after the passage of this act shall be compulsively enrolled for military service during the existing insurrection. And so what they're talking about all right there is the Civil War. Previously to this, Abraham Lincoln did use Prussian military to come into the United States and fight for the Union. This is evident in New York with the, it's not quite a reserve unit, but it's a state militia that they form. That's a Prussian unit, and the 11th Infantry out of Missouri as well is also a German or Prussian unit that exists to help the Union succeed against the South. So after this is really when that stops. So they end that system. And really that's in these conversations again between Lincoln and Kaiser Wilhelm and later Otto von Bismarck, in which they don't want us stealing their veterans. They want to keep those people in country for the Prussian-Franco Wars and all the different wars that are happening with Prussia during this time. But prior to this, 1848 to 1864, that does happen quite often. Usually, like with the Eichmanns in the Bronx, you'll see them end up in St. Louis first, through the Prussian consulate, and then traveling up to Minnesota or wherever their unit would be developed from that point. The next part of this is really it just gets deeper. Um, talking about salaries, but they make contracts with different railroads and transportation companies in the United States for transportation tickets to be furnished to such immigrants and to be paid for by those immigrants, and shall under the rules be prescribed by the Commissioner of Immigration to protect such immigrants from imposition and fraud. So this is just an act that states that we're going to provide them transportation to the in parts of the country. So Kansas, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Chicago. They don't just get off the ship in Castle Garden or Baltimore or Buffalo and then find their own way into the country. They are brought by this system through these different transportation with the cheapest and most expeditious manner in place for their destinations. And like I said, this language is basically saying that this is okay. But this is describing debt bondage, which is illegal later on, much later on. But this is how it was done. Um, you could not be a Polish immigrant at this time without going through this system. You could be a German immigrant or other immigrants, but the Eastern Europeans, especially Norway and Sweden, were also involved in this system. And there's not much there. I'm just giving an opportunity for people to read the whole thing. But this is talking specifically about land, and corporations having lands for sale to immigrants or carrying the transportation of immigrants, and what to do about that, which we'll talk in depth a little bit later. And again, penalties for not doing it right, or basically saying that you're not allowed to profit from this if you work for the government. And so it's the development of other companies that end up doing this for the government. Further on, we have just on that same day, the American Immigrant Company that's developed well before 1864. So we know that prior to this law, we are actually doing this already. This act is just to basically formulate systems and standards and protections for immigrants. And so even if you came in 1859, you would still often be trafficked through these companies. But this is the systematic process. And so he says the system is adopted, is very complete, involving agencies in all parts of Europe and an efficient administration here. And so this isn't somebody random just going from another country, buying a ticket like we would today to go and travel. There actually is a system and agencies involved in all parts of Europe to be able to get effective workforce to the United States for labor, as well as Brazil and other countries. Canada is also involved, though it's just each country has their own unique story that requires you to dig a little bit deeper and go into the exact processes that are in place. But each one is effectively the same, with these agencies that are working to move people around the world. The difficulty in this case is peculiar. It is not only an ordinary risk of breach of contract by an irresponsible party, but also the special temptation to escape the repayment of the money advanced to them. And so one of the main problems of this system is that, yeah, sure, you can traffic somebody into Ellis Island. You can buy them. That's Castle Garden at the time. You could purchase them for $3 for a female, $5 for a man. But once you took them to the farm, what kept them there? And so this company is writing back to Congress saying, you didn't add anything to make it so that we could really use coercive labor practices to keep them in the contract. And so they write this letter to Congress, they adjust the bill and create new systems of coercion to keep, and what is allowed and what is not allowed, because the ultimate fear is to return back to slavery, right? And so we don't want to do that. And they are definitely trying to make it a better system, but they just fall short of the mark. And so by enabling an employer to follow the immigrant and impound his wages and dues wherever he finds him. And so there's a story in Winona about a guy, a Bambanek, that travels here into Winona, and the police come from New York and they arrest him and they take him back to New York. And that's kind of where the story ends around here. But really, what is happening there? Why in the world would somebody, a U.S. Marshal, travel to Winona and pick this guy up and take him back to New York? Well, it's an interesting story because that individual ran from his contract. And so in the beginning, you could actually assign a U.S. Marshal to go and pick this individual up and take them back to that original person to be able to pay for that labor, pay for your contract and get out of that. Um, and so this is just explaining all that. Like, again, you can pause it and read it. But the right of a workman thus to mortgage his future labor is admitted in the bill and is essential to it. And so he is stating that you have to, not only is the system what it is, a bondage labor system, but we also need these coercive labor practices. And so later on, we'll have some examples of what is actually done to coerce these populations into sticking to their contracts. But this is the standard developed by our own Congress. And so it talks about how, what do you do if somebody runs away? And what is the reason that they're running away is because the person in charge is not paying them. They're not giving them food. They're not giving them clothes. Is there a solution to that? And it basically states that they only have to pay back $50. That's not a lot of money, even though they're not really getting paid. So how do they get this $50? How do you keep track of that? There's no system in place to protect the immigrant from that contract. It is all up to the person. But it basically states that no matter how bad this person is, it's only $50. Just work your contract off, get out of the contract, and then you can move on with your life. You can contract your freedom. And so the importing of immigrants will not exceed $50. And this small sum, the immigrant ought to work out even under a disagreeable master. And I think that it kind of is very telling about what is actually going on here when it comes to the individual. Now, individual companies can be a disagreeable master, they could be an agreeable master, but ultimately the companies in the United States are their new master in exchange for the German Junker that they left. And this just goes over, it's just to provide evidence that this is a system. This letter was written by John Williams, and he was one of the directors hired by the U.S. Congress as a general agent for immigration. And same thing, these people are just arguing back and forth. This is the addition to that bill that provides more language as to the coercive practices that are being done. And that particular one was written by a guy named Pasheen Smith, and with additions from the Honorable Elihu B. Washburn, the Chairman, Committee of Commerce, and a House of Representative. And so this is really the same language, just repeating itself. Everybody agrees that immigrant labor needs to be, with legalized contracts, and you need to be able to coerce them into completing those contracts. And another one from John P. Cummings, the Superintendent of Immigration. This one was signed in 1866, and so they're still doing this a couple of years later. Just having these conversations about how to recover those debts, and how to operate this system of labor. But the truth of the matter is that pauper labor is a term invented by protectionists or corporations to cover rich men's stealings. And I think that's the most general term that we can produce. While it's contract labor and it sounds like it's all nice and fluffy, or pauper labor as they begin to call it through labor unions, it really is just a term to cover the rich men's, utilizing cheap labor to drive down labor prices in the country so that they don't have to pay a lot of money to get things done. And so what we're actually talking about is commodity-based labor. And commodity-based labor was originally developed through chattel slavery in the United States. So again, you have to understand African-American history before you can really understand what's going on with the rest of the country. But basically, in a laissez-faire capitalistic system, where you do not have the power, or the government does not have the power to restrict any part of a company. Today we have restrictions, right? We have a minimum wage, we have, safety practices, we have OSHA, we have all of these companies. The reason those things exist is because if you allow companies just to do it on their own and you don't have those restrictions, this is ultimately what happens. You utilize a population, you don't pay them well, and it's basically called a system worse than slavery, because a commodity-based labor system, even a slave has value. But a worker in a laissez-faire capitalistic system does not have value. You can work that person to death, and then you just bring in another one for free. You don't actually have to pay them or pay for them. And so there's a lot of people, a lot of historians that are coming out in 2020 to 2024 saying that this system is actually worse than slavery, especially with the convict leasing in the South, because you can kill as many as you want, and all you have to do is go get more. It's not actually the worker no longer has a value. And so labor determined on how cheap you can find it. And so if you can go into other countries and bring in pauper labor, one, they're not used to getting paid very much with the serfdom systems that were in place. And so you can bring them to the United States and continue to drive down labor prices. So we have convict leasing in the 13th Amendment. There is freedom of slavery, except as punishment for a crime, which is often why you find the black codes in the South and the re-enslavement of African Americans, with Texas still making $11 million a month from their convicts in there at the Texas State Penitentiary in Huntsville. Oddly enough, still picking cotton, if you could kind of get that into your head and see how that system continued on after slavery. But what we also have is the padrone systems, that boss systems with the Italians, the Chinese, and the Spanish population, and contract labor, or what they call pauper labor, with Polish, Eastern Europeans, Hungarians are also involved, Norwegians, and Swedish. Not to mention the Native American industrial schools that are trying to create labor forces out of those populations, and the system of what they call free labor, which is just controversial in its term, because it makes you think that it's free labor, like you have the freedom to engage with labor, but ultimately it doesn't mean that. And so just a quick example, this is probably the best example to explain what's going on, but it's in Holyoke, Massachusetts. So we're going to get into Minnesota and other Midwest states here shortly. But this individual was caught in 1888, and 1888 was a big year for Polish people. I mean, that is really when all of the newspapers from around the country are talking about Polish pauper labor and the problematic system that it is. But this individual is still doing this. And so the newspapers report that he goes down to Castle Garden. He purchased them $3 for a female, $5 for a man, $8 for a couple, and turns around and puts them into Holyoke, Massachusetts for $10 a month, and then keeps that labor from them. The total $120 he makes per individual, and doesn't actually pay them anything. And so they end up at the poorhouses, or at poor relief, with the poor relief agents reporting all of these Poles coming in. They have no clothes, they have no food, they're starving to death, and he has to actually give them poor relief. And so while they campaign for poor relief, but what actually happens is that foreigners, not citizens of the nation, do not qualify for poor relief. So what do? And that goes into the system where most of the Polish population and others rely on the church and go and engage in these early insurance companies like the PNA and the PRCUA, Polish National Alliance, Polish Roman Catholic Union of America, for that aid to be able to live and survive through their contracts. But this individual did have what they called a Polish slave chained to his wagon on November 24th, 1887. He was going to return him to New York because he was insane, because he kept running away from his contract. But if you're not getting paid and you're hardly eating and you have no clothes and it's the middle of November, I would be running away from that contract too. And so we don't know how many actually escaped into the inner parts of America without completing their contract. That is obviously a possibility, that your ancestors never actually paid back that contract. They just left and went and started their life. But again, there is those U.S. Marshals that would go and round those people up to try and make this system work. So at the end of it, he basically thanks the newspaper for all of the advertising because sales are up during his trial in 1887 into 1888. He's only fined $500 for almost killing this guy in the middle of winter with no clothes and just chained to a wagon while he's at the bar. But then he goes on to be a banker in Holyoke, and it leads a very successful career after that. Chicago Polish labor is also pretty much the same kind of deal. You're bringing people into the industrial system, railroads, and everything that exists in Chicago. And this was printed in the St. Paul Globe in 1888 again in February. And so we're starting to talk about the actual living conditions of Polish people as they're coming to the United States. They live in these shacks, or you could call them shotgun houses. I don't think that term is even applicable for Winona, though tends to be what we call them. But you would build these little villages out of whatever materials you could find. But you are living on the floor. You're not able to afford comfort, and so it's basic living. Not necessarily coming in and having the comforts of these different homes. And so they built this community and utilized this labor. And so you can see the individuals there that would go to the for heating. They would go and try and pick the coal that fell off the trains, sleeping on the floor, having animals live with you inside the home because you don't have a barn, and all these types of just poverty that exists within the Polish communities. And so did Minnesota participate? Absolutely. And so this is, again, August 9th, 1888 from the St. Paul Globe. And it's an article titled Brought Here in Bonds. And again, bondage labor. And so thousands of Russian and Polish serfs imported by contractors, and they labor for a pittance. Now, I want to caveat this because Minnesota is actually very different than these other states because we have lots of labor bureaus here that are trying to protect the labor of American laborers. So the Knights of Labor is pretty popular in St. Paul and Minneapolis. Even in Winona, they have different labor unions that develop. But it's basically this fight in Minnesota specifically where they don't allow you to not pay your workers. But they do allow you to pay Polish pauper labor a lower wage. But in doing so, it drives down the labor of other individuals. And so they really fight against that. And there's hundreds, if not thousands, of newspaper articles that exist in Minnesota in which the Knights of Labor and other labor unions are fighting against corporations for fair wages and reduction in hours. In order to keep labor prices at a standard of a living wage. And so that I kind of skipped ahead, but this is basically a document that states that there aren't in 1891, there aren't a lot of riots and strikes and things that exist in other Polish communities because the high average of wages paid is $600 per year per man. And the fact that constant employment is giving these factories worth just twice as much as what the sawmills is giving employment for 6 months. That's why we don't have these strikes up in St. Paul and Minneapolis. But however, in that it mentions that sawmills are not giving their laborers a living wage. And so why in Minnesota do most Polish laborers end up in the lumber companies or the railroad? It kind of tells that story. We're just collecting evidence to tell exactly what's going on locally. And so Winona comes out in 1865 and they come out with this article and they're pleading to the community. They're basically stating, how do we become a relevant city? The local population of people in 1865 is only 15,000 people. And so how do we get more people to come here? How do we engage and increase our labor, increase our ability to expand and have a legitimate community to create a bigger city? And so it in there it states that they're going to start procuring cheap labor. And so the sentence is down there at the bottom. The subject of manufacturers is attended with many conditions, with new places and small towns find it very difficult to provide. Such a certainty of finding a ready market for articles made, sufficiency of capital to conduct manufacturing, and without embarrassment, we need the ability to procure cheap labor. And so at least they're mindful that this contract labor system is not necessarily what we want, because it's going to drive down average labor prices. But we don't really have a choice. We've got to bring in these individuals to build up our town, so that we last into the future without becoming one of these small towns that disappears. And so during that time in 1888, we begin to see all of the labor strikes. And so in this one is July 5th, and 1,000 men, mostly Polish laborers, being in and about the hall, start striking, with Derdowski at the lead. And who they're attacking is the Winona Lumber Company. So not necessarily Laird, Norton, or the other ones that exist here, Empire and the others. They continue to wait to see what happens with the Winona Lumber Company. And so they're waiting to see if Winona Lumber falls, then they'll go ahead and follow suit, and pay decent wages. But this was kind of the first time that I could find. I know that there's one in the annex building and in our book here at the museum that talks about an 1863 strike. But I just couldn't find that article or other evidence to include what was happening earlier on. But this is happening where Polish labor unions are being created in Winona to fight against this system. They also say it's kind of interesting that, take warning, no outsiders will be allowed to work in the mills of the city. There are plenty of workmen here to do all of the work. The Winona Lumber Company began with 11 hours of work and only promising to pay for 10 hours. And this is all the way in 1888. And so the other mills will follow if they succeed. And so they're just fighting against the system. And before we go to the specific examples, I just wanted to talk about the myth of immigrating for land, versus migrating to land after contract. And I didn't copy any of the newspaper articles, but there's several examples where the bishops are actually creating Polish populations, Polish communities. And so I think that's true here with Kvader. And I'm probably butchering that last name, but he was a bishop from Chicago that came here and started the St. Stanislaus Church. And then he was removed by Bishop Cotter in 1894 with about half of St. Stan's built. And so they only had $75,000 in a half-built building, and Bishop Cotter removed him from the area. And so there was a big riot. They arrested this individual, took him down to the jail. And so the entire Kashubian Polish community over here rose up, marched with a procession down to the prison, and demanded his release. So they ended up giving him a $500 bond, took him out of the jail and appeased the population. But they had the National Guard stationed outside of town, ready to attack the Polish people if they marched on the prison. And so, but we're also talking about migrating to land. So once you come to this country, you can end up in Stevens Point, you can end up in Chicago, Detroit, St. Louis, New York, all of these different areas. You can spend a year contracting your freedom, get back your freedom, and be able to move to wherever you want to. However, it is not the Immigration Act of 1862. You are not coming here and automatically given 160 acres to go and farm, and then you come by yourself by wagon, wherever, into Nebraska, North Dakota, Minnesota, wherever. That's not actually what's happening. And then if you go across the road here, or across the river into Wisconsin, you can see that they're not 160 acre plots. They're 30 acre or 10 acre plots. And so what's actually happening here? Well, the railroad company owned a checkerboard pattern of land on each side of the railroad. That's out of place. And the land grants between 1850 and 1872 were started. And so what's happening here is that the land sales or the railroads sold the land to the settlers. To promote foreign settlement in the Western United States. And some railroads even had offices in Europe. And like I said, there's that connection, those international conversations that are happening. But they sold the land in the same system. And so if you come here and you want these 30-acre plots, sure, the railroad will give you them, but until you sell or repay those land grants back to the railroad company, they own the profits that you make from that property. And so the Peloskis over next door, I know that they're pretty adamant to say they came from Stevens Point and they came here for land because of the ability, but you got to really think about the area that we live in. These are not prime real estate for farming. You often had to clear out the lumber first, get all the root systems out, remove all the rocks, and then you could farm your property. And so it wasn't the best place to go for land. Now it's fertile. It can today obviously we see the success of those farmers and how all of that work ended up being profitable, but originally it's more of like, we don't really want this land because it's not easy to farm, so we'll go ahead and give it to these immigrants and make them work the land in order to profit from it. We'll get that profit back, and then basically leveraging those individuals to create profit from these strips of land. Now in other places they do the same thing all across the United States. And so we have a map here, 1860 railroads, ends right outside of Winona. You can see up there at the top, running through Wisconsin. And then also using these populations to basically, and it's a little bit more complicated than this, but basically what you would do is you would build 20 miles of railroad. They would own about 50 miles. Every other mile they would go left and right. And so this mile they own this part of 50 miles back. And it's also important to know that in order to get your crop to that railroad, you have to live within 20 miles of the railroad. Because by the time you transport your crop to that railroad to get it to market, if it's more than 20 miles, it's going to take more than a few days. And oftentimes by the time your crop got to market, it was rotten. So it was worthless. And so that's also honestly what's happening in Canada is they don't have the infrastructure built to get their crops to market. And so lots of those Polish farmers that go up to the northern parts of Canada and try and homestead, they end up ditching those lands because it's not profitable. And so they end up migrating into the United States, which is kind of the second era of immigration here in Winona, is that people from Canada are coming to try and get closer to the railroad with these homesteads and work the land that way. And so I'll just get into, just to mention a little bit before I forget, the squatters' rights in the East End. They're not actually buying the land that they come here to. And this is pretty well known. This is an article from 1981 talking about Eichmann and Bronk, the first two Kashubians here in town, who actually had squatters' rights. Now, Laird himself also had squatters' rights. He didn't pay for the land for the lumber yard that's right where we're standing today and across the street over there. But it's a territorial district that they're using what is called the Wabasha Protection Club. And it was established to settle disputes between who was supposed to own the land and those aggressors or squatters that had occupied the land. And so the criterion used for the club favored those aggressors or those squatters, which is also the same thing in Jones Island and other Kashubian places where they squat on these what do they call them, swamplands, because no one wants them until the Kashubians develop them, and then all of a sudden there's an interest to get that land back. And so they basically state that if you come on the land and you have improved it in any way, shape, or form, that land should then belong to you. And thus Polish settlers laid claim to the eastern section, called claim number 3 on the East End, which is actually just across the street, and made visible attempts to improve the condition and were allowed to stay. But Laird intended to use those lots for the lumber company, and so he bought that land from Bronx and Eichmann's, and the Bronx and Eichmann's moved farther into the East End, where the East End village is today. And so those hills and valleys surrounding Winona are said to remind the settlers of their homes in Poland. I think a lot of that is family history that's passed down, or there is actually no evidence as to that's why they're here. It's more so the Prussian consulate working with the railroad companies and working with industries to supply that labor. which is more evident, has more evidence than just this idea that they're coming here because the land looks familiar. Now, if you're a Prussian person, you know what the land looks like in Kashubia. Would you bring in somebody that's from, say, Florida up to Minnesota to do hard labor in the winters up here? Absolutely not. It would not be, it wouldn't, just wouldn't work. And so you want people that are familiar with swamps, that can cultivate swamp areas. Those are the laborers that you're seeking. And so you would have those types of individuals being brought here. Same thing with the Sami that are sent to Alaska, right? They're in the northern parts of the world. They're used to these harsh winters. They know how to operate and know how to work things. And so it is a kind of a system of success. You want immigrants that can do the job. And so you bring people to these common areas so that they can flourish, the communities can flourish, and you can really take advantage of them to the fullest extent. Um, it's the same thing with African American workers that went into the South prior to the end of slavery. You wouldn't want, Chinese workers that have never seen a sugar cane in their entire life. You would want somebody that's familiar with that job. So you don't really have to train them. You don't have to really do anything. You just transfer one job from one country to the other. And so by 1860, at least 30,000 Poles lived in America, scattered throughout 34 states and 7 territories comprising the Union. Poles fought for both the South and North after the Civil War. American railroads imported Polish immigrants to Minnesota, Wisconsin, Illinois, Nebraska, and Iowa to settle in agricultural and mining colonies. This is actually from the Burlington, Missouri Railroad website, and alone moved 300 families to Nebraska in 1877 to land that it had acquired by congressional land grants and then resold them to those communities. And so the railroad has a lot to do with where Polish communities end up because they buy these populations, they build 20 miles of railroad, they want to put a town to service that industry, they build another 20 miles, they want another town. And so it's almost as if they're basically going to Castle Garden, buying a ship, putting it on the railroad, taking it to the end of the railroad, dropping that community off, building another 20 miles, and then building another town. And that is how we expanded westward. Most people that are native to America prior to these dates, they're not going to leave Philadelphia or their homes to go to the West. That's not really what was happening. So there's a movie or a show that just came out called 1883, and I think it's one of the best historically accurate versions of the westward expansion, because in that video, yes, there is what's his name, Samuel Elliott, that is the wagon driver that takes these people, and he speaks English. But everyone that he's taking, except for McGuire, the country singer, uh, Faith Hill, and I can never remember his name, but her husband that act in that show. Um, uh, are the only ones that speak English, and the rest of them were speaking German, and were these Polish pauper workers that were actually inhabiting the westward expansions. Um, stopping off at places like, oh, this is far enough, and we'll go ahead and have this town. They did forget that it was systematic. They, didn't add that. It was actually designed that way. But it does show that most of the immigrants expanding, or most of the people expanding into the West, were immigrants, not necessarily native English speakers. So this system is supposed to end in 1884, but we know from 1888 and Charles T. Parsons that it didn't actually do so. But there is an alien contract labor law that is designed to get rid of this contract labor, and it just fails to do so. There's really no meat or no punishment for still using this system. And so we see with Parsons that and other places that even though there's a law doesn't necessarily mean you stop looking for the evidence. But it does come out and they do pass this, and then later on they don't actually they have to keep making laws and changing things to get people to stop doing it, because it doesn't really stop until World War One, and we will find evidence of that. But if you keep looking and you keep, this is just the caveat that a lot of people see this and they go, okay, well, contract labor is over, or Civil War and emancipation happened, so slavery is over. Well, that's not necessarily the case. People and companies are going to do whatever they can to get cheap labor to elevate themselves and pushing down those workers. And that's just how things were. That's how this laissez-faire capitalism worked and why we needed all of those laws in the 1900s to stop this kind of abuse from happening. And so labor trafficking is finally illegal in 1956, but this is after World War II, and we see the development of the concentration camps and the Gulag of Russia. So the 20 million Polish people that were murdered during the Gulag of Russia, when Russia and the Nazis had an agreement together to genocide the Polish population and take over the modern Polish state. And so we saw that happening, and we just didn't really want to copy that. And so we made a law finally making bondage labor illegal, but it wasn't until 1956. And so if you guys have any questions, just go ahead and email me, director@polishmuseumwinona.org, and we can, further talk about this. I can send you more evidence, more books to read about this system. But it is important to discuss this era of immigration as it is, so that we fully understand what's going on locally and around the country with these Polish communities and Polish pauper labor bureaus. So thank you for coming. I appreciate all of you. And like I said, if you have any questions, just email me and we can discuss it further. You guys have a great day.